Dilek, welcome to Tibet TV's weekly analysis. On Monday, I was unhappy because I had to leave home. On Tuesday, I was happy because a new Chinese teacher came to our class and she was very pretty. On Wednesday, I was unhappy because I missed home. On Thursday, I was happy because I could go watch TV with others. On Friday, I was unhappy because teacher Lhadon was sick. On Saturday, I was really sad because my family didn't come to see me. On Sunday, I was unhappy. On Monday, I was unhappy as well. On Tuesday, I was happy because I had manthao to eat. On Wednesday, I was so happy because I could go home. This was written by one of the fourth-year Tibetan students in a Chinese colonial boarding school in Lhasa. It shows the isolation and lack of family upbringing in the Chinese colonial boarding schools. Today we will discuss Tibet Action Institute's report on separated from their families, hidden from the world, China's vast system of colonial boarding schools inside Tibet. To discuss on the report, I have with me Lhadon Tethong, who is currently serving as the director of the Tibet Action Institute. So Lhadon, I wanted to begin by asking about the gist of the report and why are the Chinese authorities compelling Tibetan parents to send their children into boarding schools in cities. So what is the main reason behind this approach?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the authorities have moved to entirely, a vast majority of Tibetan students now are in boarding school from what our research reveals. So at least 78% of all Tibetan students between ages 6 and 18. And that number does not include an unknown number of 4 and 5-year-olds who are in boarding preschools. We know this from firsthand accounts from Tibet, but we don't have any number that we could find from Chinese government sources. So I think the purpose is clear from their side in their propaganda, in their high-level speeches, Xi Jinping's high-level speeches. The policy now is to separate children from their parents and have them live in the schools so as to erase, fundamentally influence their Tibetan identity, because the Chinese Communist Party is seeking to build, sort of replacing Tibetan identity with the Chinese identity so as to ensure loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party, which really means to try to eliminate Tibetan resistance and to go after the children, the most vulnerable, is obviously the plan here.
So, Lhadon, in the findings of the report, it is said that the Chinese colonial boarding schools are very much discriminatory and has lots of negative impacts on Tibetan children. So, can you tell us that what are the major impacts and how it impacts the culture of Tibet?
I think the obvious short-term impacts, which we are hearing from on the ground, especially with the very young children being sent away from their families, that the right away language is impacted because the majority of the schooling is in Chinese, in Mandarin. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't get a Tibetan language class, which of course China will use as evidence that the Tibetan students are not cut off from their language. But one Tibetan language class for a whole life lived in Chinese language and studying in Chinese and Mandarin, that is not enough, not for Tibetan children. And these kids, we hear, especially the young ones, come home after some months and they are not speaking easily in Tibetan. They're already switching. I can see that with my young children. It makes such an impact at the age of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, those ages. You really influence quite easily your language. And so in the short term, it's automatically impacting their ability to communicate with grandparents, older members of the family who might not speak Chinese or Mandarin fluently. But I think in the long term, this school experience where you're cut off from your family, even if it looks like you could be getting a modern education, or even if they make the argument, the Chinese authorities, that Tibetan students need to be able to compete and succeed in China, really, it's not about that. It's about the kids and the children identifying first with being Chinese and second only as Tibetan. Because if you live in the school, if you're not able to, as we know, practice Tibetan Buddhism, right? No, religion is not allowed in Chinese state-run schools. If you're not allowed to speak in Tibetan all day long, and if you really can't fundamentally access authentic Tibetan culture, not just song and dance for exercise class, that is not a true Tibetan authentic cultural experience. And these kids spend years and years and years of their lives in such an environment. What does that impact? What is that impact on the long-term survival of Tibetan culture and language? When you're talking about, I have to stress again, our numbers, at least 800 to 900,000 students is what we're able to decipher from the sources that we were able to access. So the numbers are probably a lot higher, and the ages are probably are certainly younger than we even can find easily accessible right now. And so that means a truly devastating negative impact and a real threat to the fundamental survival of Tibetan language and culture long term.
So Lhadon, actually I have also been to a boarding school. So I'm very curious to know the difference between Chinese colonial boarding school and the rest of the boarding schools. So can you tell us the difference?
Yeah, so the key here would be, I think the number one is the intention from the state at the highest level to transform and change identity. That is absolutely key and critical. But I think the most important thing for Tibetans is there's no real choice. We're not saying the Chinese government is leading people into these schools in handcuffs. No, we're not saying that. But the entire system is designed so parents have no real options. First of all, it's a fundamentally coercive environment. The high level of repression means that resistance is not really an option. And Tibetan parents want their children to be educated. Even the most rural and nomadic families and communities, they want their children to have education and have a good chance at a life in this sort of changing world. But why does that choice for them have to mean sending their children away? The local options should be there. The high quality Tibetan language, mother tongue education, that should be the right for Tibetan children and for Tibetan parents. And it's not like choosing here to send a child away to boarding school where they're going to have all the resources and they're going to have a wonderful experience. And I choose to send my child to boarding school at an older age. This is like sending, in some cases, babies. I have a 5-year-old. I know how much he needs me. To send a 5-year-old to a boarding school and then to change the entire sort of culture that they're immersed in. It's not right. It's a violation of their human rights. It's a violation of Tibetans' collective rights. And I think it doesn't have to be that the kids and the families are led in handcuffs and at gunpoint for this to be coercive, for it to be wrong, and for us to be saying they're being forced. They truly are, through policies and an entire system that's designed really with a racist intent that sort of says Tibetans need to be changed, that what we are is, and that our culture and our language is not good enough and it needs to be better and be Chinese. That is wrong. It's an outdated way of thinking. That's it should be a sort of a colonial mindset of the past. And I think here it really constitutes a massive and fundamental violation of Tibetan rights in an international context. And it's ultimately cultural genocide happening right before our eyes in the 21st century.
So after the Xi Jinping's rise to the power, the situation inside Tibet got even worse. So my question is, how is Xi Jinping's outlook towards the sinicization of Tibetans, particularly the Tibetan children, with reference to your report?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think they see this as the solution. Tibetans are different. Tibetans are not Chinese, and they see that as the problem. Right? In other modern and progressive societies, cultural difference, this is all supposed to be celebrated. In the People's Republic of China under Xi Jinping now, this is absolutely a threat to the Communist Party control. It's a political problem that needs to be eliminated. And sadly, I think Tibetan children are right now on the very front line of this war on Tibetans. And we can see obviously happening also to Uyghurs and also to Southern Mongolians. in slightly different ways, but a lot of the similar approach. And I think in Tibet, because the Chinese government is very aware of international pressure and scrutiny, because of the work of His Holiness, because of the work of the Tibetan government in exile and the Tibet movement all these years, there has been a spotlight shining on Tibet. So I think now they've really learned how to do these. I heard one Tibetan scholar call it recently, these kind of hidden policies. And they've sort of rolled out this massive colonial boarding school program in a way under the radar, under the kind of cloak of the darkness of the information blackout and the lockdown of Tibet. So we have sort of pieced together a picture with these shards of information that tell us a really terrible story. But it wasn't super clear until Xi Jinping came to power. It wasn't very clear that in the end, this is all where it's going. Now it's clear. I mean, I don't think anyone should have any illusions that the fundamental goal here of the Communist Party and Xi Jinping from the highest levels is to eliminate Tibetan identity over time, starting with the children. And that makes sense in terms of the long-term goal of the Communist Party, which is just to stay in power and to eliminate all threats and all opposition.
So in exile in, I think, 1970s and 80s, if I'm not mistaken, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama called the Tibetan children as the future seed of Tibet. So this is a very important. So do you think the Chinese colonial boarding schools are an antidote to these mission?
Oh, for sure. I think you can look at it that way exactly. You know, I think one of the impacts, if you think about this generation of Tibetan children growing up inside Tibet, imagine a day in the life where there is no parental influence. So you don't see the offerings, you don't see the sort of Buddhist rituals, Tibetan Buddhist rituals that would be taking place in the home. You don't interact in Tibetan all day long while you're in class. And it sounds like these, from what we can gather, these are schools that are run with a military style management. They say that themselves in many places that we were able to look at sources online. So the kids are in this very regimented, structured environment that's all mostly in Chinese, but for their Tibetan language class. And they have, at the end of the day, no family to go back to and talk about the day in Tibetan or to process how, their life was, what they've been learning. You don't even get that extra sort of layer of Tibetan at the end of the day. And again, no Tibetan cultural experience. And this goes on day after day, week after week, month after month. And we can tell a lot of the kids, we don't know for sure, a lot of the kids live far from home and they don't get to go home very often. So over time, certainly those seeds, those precious seeds, those children grow up without the nourishment of their own Tibetan language and culture. This is a very delicate and important part of life, especially those very young ages, elementary school ages, preschool age. And so if you think about what that means for not just one generation, but for generations of Tibetans, it's devastating. And I think we all need to understand this issue. We need to speak about it clearly. And we need to, push back on the Chinese leadership from the highest levels. And I would also say just one thing I have learned from Tibetans over all of these years, especially Tibetans inside Tibet, is that the fighting spirit is there. So I do not believe the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping will be successful in the long run to eliminate Tibetan's sense of self. I think even Tibetan kids who are sent to China and still are to boarding school and live far away from their families for a whole year, they have maintained, we see them maintain their Tibetan identity, though they have to fight for it. I think this will also happen in Tibet, but a lot of damage will happen and unnecessary suffering for these kids, just at a fundamental level, for all of our children to have to live in Tibet, up to say 80% at least, to live away from family and away from the care and protection of their parents, and just the love and the daily nourishment that the parents provide in terms of love and affection and care. This is a massive, massive violation of Tibetan rights. And it's such a wrong on a huge scale, and it must be righted. And that's why we have to be clear. We have to speak out. and we have to hold the Chinese government accountable on the international stage, even if right now they seem like they're immovable, even if they seem like they don't, Xi Jinping doesn't care what the world thinks, they do. And fundamentally, we will spotlight this issue. And in the long term, I think we have to push for this to be absolutely reversed and changed.
Lhadon, you have rightly mentioned that these schools violate Tibetan rights. But in the report, you have also strongly mentioned that the colonial boarding schools in China violate international and domestic laws. So can you tell us how?
Well, as far as we all know, still the Chinese constitution and the regional ethnic autonomy laws, they still say that Tibetans have, that so-called ethnic minorities of China have the right to decide, what their education policy and the language of education, and to put Tibetan language first in the case of Tibet, obviously. So in so many different ways, also for the parents to choose what is the preferred way to educate the child, what kind of school, send them home, keep them. All of these basic rights, so-called rights that do exist under Chinese law or in the Chinese constitution, they're being violated. So we can see the Chinese government usually gets around any kind of laws on the books for protecting Tibetan culture, rights, or language by saying, oh, this, they'll say this or that was undermining state security, right? Or it was subversion, or they do that with individuals. But in this case, where they're pushing this, the Chinese language, Model 2, they call it, the so-called bilingual education, when they're pushing it on the entire Tibetan population, this shows us that fundamentally the rights that they have, the legal protections that are existing on the books are not being followed. That's just that and whether they're going to change them or not, I don't know. But we see, we see the Chinese government violating not just international law, but their own supposed law and sort of constitutional protections for individuals and groups, including Tibetans.
So, Lhadon, before we conclude, I just want you to talk on the recommendations that are mentioned in the report to investigate these Chinese colonial boarding schools in Tibet. So, can you tell us what are these recommendations?
So I think right at the top, we're calling on the United Nations, especially the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and also, concerned governments to press for access. This is, we know, Tibetans, we can see access is the key. And just because the Chinese government won't give it, or they want to do stage managed, tours, that doesn't mean we don't press. And the international community should be demanding access to Tibet. This is one of the largest, areas in the entire world that is completely inaccessible, truly, to the international community. And this is obvious that this is a problem. So access to investigate. People need to see, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights needs to go and see for herself what is happening and press for meaningful, unfettered access. Now, some will say, well, the Chinese government is not going to give that right now. That doesn't mean you don't ask. What the Chinese government wants more than anything is for everyone to say, oh, it's too hard, it's too difficult, we can't get in, there's too many complications. We'll just look from out here and do what we can. No, that is not good enough. And if the world stops asking to get in, it sends the message to Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership that actually they've won. That they've been successful, that they tried to lock Tibet away and Tibetans away from the world, and now the world has kind of given up trying to get in. So fundamentally push for access, immediately name the colonial boarding school system and this separation of children from their parents and the Chinese language, medium of instruction, education, all of that, name it as wrong. This is something colonial governments did in should be the past, and they've apologized for. And this is not the time in the 21st century. Any government should be doing this to people, let alone an entire nation with such a distinct, ancient, and proud history and tradition. This is not the way you operate as a responsible government and member of the international community in this day and age. So calling them out for doing it, and then looking for ways, we say whatever tools are available, sanctions on individuals involved in education policy, at every level, even down to supporting Tibetan language education initiatives in exile, even right down to that level. This is the kind of support that governments can give to Tibetans to make it through this difficult time. This will not be our whole future. This will end, but we need to make it end as fast as possible. We need to shine the spotlight on it, and we need to ensure that, the efforts that are taken in exile to preserve Tibetan language and culture, that they're given an extra boost and push with support from the international community. And that means funding and resources. And I would say from the Tibetan government side, there have been some children's videos and things that have been put online that now my 2-year-olds and my 5-year-old watch. They are helping them to learn Tibetan and to reinforce Tibetan language for them. These are the kind of initiatives that we need more of. And this is also where governments can help. So it's both going after the Chinese government for these wrong policies, holding them accountable, and at the same time supporting the positive, proactive policies that will really help Tibetans also in the long run.
Thank you so much, Lhadon, for joining us virtually and talking on a very important report that your institute has published. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.